Good morning. On Thursday, the 16th of July, and this morning I'm going to share with you something that I've received from a colleague, Reverend Mark, in the South Wales Baptist Association, and it reflects exactly the way that I'm trying to think things through at the moment with regard to our church being able to reopen in due course for worship, and the way in which we regard singing in worship. I love to sing, however badly, and I know most of you do too. And I really, really rather like this, and I'm going to share some of it with you. He quotes first something from a book called The Vision and the Vow. It reads, "A distinguished art critic was studying an exquisite painting by the Italian Renaissance master Filippino Lippi. He stood in London's National Gallery and gazed at this 15th century image of Mary holding the infant Jesus on her lap, with the saints, Dominic and Jerome, kneeling nearby. But the painting troubled him. There was no doubt of Lippi's skill, of his ability as an artist, but something about the proportions of the picture seemed wrong. The hills in the background seemed exaggerated, as if they might kind of fall out of the frame, and the kneeling saints looked awkward and uncomfortable. The art critic Robert Cumming wasn't the first to criticise this work for its perspective, but he had a revelation. He wondered if perhaps the problem might be his. The painting had never been intended to end up in a gallery. It had been commissioned to hang in a church. So the dignified art critic dropped to his knees in the public gallery in front of the painting. And then he saw what generations of art critics had missed. From his new vantage point on his knees, Robert Cumming found himself gazing up at a perfectly proportioned piece of art. The foreground had moved naturally to the background. The saints seemed settled, their awkwardness now grace. Mary now looked intently and kindly, and the perspective of the painting wasn't what had been wrong. It never was wrong. It was the perspective of the people looking at it. And whilst on his knees, the critic found a beauty that only was visible to those who indeed looked at this painting from the correct perspective. Now, I've put an image of that painting at the front of this today so that you get an idea of what it looks like. But what Reverend Mark is saying, and what I've been thinking about too during this last week, alongside, I think, worship leaders in our tradition in particular, perhaps, where music is so much central to what we do, that our perspective can make such a big difference on our position of worship. And the Welsh guidelines are still, we're still waiting on being told when we can go back to church for worship, as opposed to simply being open for private prayer for one or two people. And amongst our challenges has to be that of congregational singing, because it is central to the Welsh nonconformist traditions, and indeed some of the Welsh Anglican traditions too. That varies, of course, from church to church. And my immediate thought, of course, is one of sadness, as I imagine a church service where we can't sing our hearts out. And it's difficult to imagine that, because it's an integral part of our corporate worship. What will our worship be like if we can't sing? Now, as an aside here, just before I kind of continue with this reflection, I want to say that certainly my thoughts at the moment are that when we are able to get back to church in whatever the new normal looks like, we will continue to have our morning worship service broadcast as it has been through lockdown, and I don't see that ending. And during that, there will be songs for you all to join in with gusto, as I know you have been in your own homes throughout this last several months. So that will still be there too. So it may be that we have a two-pronged kind of worship with the recorded one that you see on your computers and something live. Could there be another perspective about not singing together that will benefit our position of worship? Now, there's a Matt Redman worship song, which we do know, which I've also put up this morning. And the title of it is When the Music Fades. And I didn't know this, but it was created, it was written by Matt Redman at his home church, Soul Survivor in Watford, where they felt that they were struggling with sung worship. An outside observer, Reverend Mark writes, would have regarded the music as excellent, and that the church was up to date with the current charismatic church culture. But the church leaders felt there was something missing, and that they had lost their way in worship. They made the bold decision to get rid of both the sound system and the band for a whole season. Now, that's a big deal in that church where music is really big and beautifully done. They stripped everything away to come back to the heart of worship. And the pastor at the time reminded the church family that they were not consumers of worship, but producers of worship. He asked the question, when you come through the doors on a Sunday, what are you bringing as your offering to God? Later, as the church rediscovered a heart for worship, and then reintroduced the musicians and the sound system, Matt Redman wrote this song, and it describes what was experienced. When the music fades, all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing to bring something that's of worth, that will bless your heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, Jesus. And Reverend Mark writes what I think so many of us have been thinking. Is this the beginning of a new way to worship? Is this the beginning of a new perspective on our painting, on our picture of how we worship? If we aren't allowed to sing out loud when we meet together, is there some way in which we can approach our worship, in which we can approach God in a new way? Is there a way in which we can freshen what we've been doing by changing the way that we do it? What if each of us were to understand that we are producers of worship, not consumers? That it isn't about leaders producing something that we consume, like buying something in a shop, but that every single one of us is a part of the producing of worship. And I think he's got a really good point. We can't change what we can't change in the coming months. We are going to be limited in the way in which we are able to gather together. Our building is plenty big enough with distancing to accommodate anyone who wants to come, of that I'm certain. But we need to think about how we worship. Coming back together is going to be really important, but we need to think how we worship. And I think an anticipation of what we might discover in this next part of our journey together is so important, and I'm really excited by it, because what we can't change, we can't change. I've said that, I know. But what we can do is make the new normal, isn't that an awful phrase? The new normal in our fellowship something exciting, something that we want to be part of, something that can grow and evolve in a way that involves all of us in different ways. And so I leave you now with those thoughts and with this amazing piece of music and with the painting. Until tomorrow, God bless.